Have you ever made a split-second decision that changed everything? Maybe you're watching this from your cozy living room, feeling safe and secure, but imagine being in Sienna's shoes tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from as we dive into her story. Sienna Blackwood wiped down the mahogany bar for the 100th time that night, her movements automatic after 6 months of working the late shift at Meridian, one of Chicago's most exclusive establishments. At 26, she learned to read people quickly in this job, a skill that had served her well since she'd started over with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to disappear. The bar's amber lighting cast shadows across the faces of tonight's clientele, the usual mix of wealthy businessmen, socialites, and others who moved in circles she'd never imagined before Marcus. Before everything fell apart, before she learned that love could be a cage with golden bars, she pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of mixing drinks and collecting generous tips from patrons who barely looked at her face. Invisible was exactly how she preferred these days. Invisible meant safe. That's why she noticed him the moment he walked in. He moved through Meridian's entrance like he owned not just the building, but the entire city block. Tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of tailored black suit that cost more than she made in 6 months. His dark hair was styled with casual perfection, and even from across the room, she could see the sharp angles of his face, the way other patrons unconsciously stepped aside to let him pass. Dante Romano. She'd heard the name whispered in corners, seen the deference in people's eyes when he was mentioned. The kind of man whose business dealings were discussed in euphemisms and whose protection was worth more than money could buy. Dangerous didn't begin to cover what he represented. 3 men flanked him as he approached the bar, their eyes constantly scanning the room in patterns she recognized from her own hypervigilant habits. Professional security, the kind that shot first and never bothered with questions. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a clean glass, muscle memory from months of jumping at shadows, making her hyper-aware of every movement in her peripheral vision. This was exactly the kind of attention she couldn't afford, the kind of situation she'd been trained to avoid. But as she watched, something made her stomach clench with familiar dread. The man in the gray suit, sitting 3 seats down from where Dante had settled, was too focused, too intent. She'd seen that look before, the calculated patience of someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd been nursing the same whiskey for 40 minutes, positioned with a clear view of the entrance, and now his hand moved with the fluid practice of someone who'd done this before. The small vial disappeared into Dante's drink so smoothly that anyone watching the television mounted above the bar would have missed it entirely. But Sienna had spent 8 months learning to catalog every potential threat, every escape route, every sign that her carefully constructed safety was about to crumble. Her breath caught. This wasn't her problem. This wasn't her business. She'd learned the hard way what happened when she got involved in situations beyond her control, when she trusted her instincts over her survival training. But watching Dante laugh at something one of his men said, completely unaware that death waited in the amber liquid inches from his hand, something deeper than self-preservation kicked in. The same instinct that had made her step between Marcus and his younger sister during their last fight. The same foolish courage that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them. The napkin was small, unremarkable, the kind of detail that would be forgotten the moment it served its purpose. Her pen trembled as she wrote in quick, desperate script, "Don't drink it. Act normal and leave." She folded the napkin twice, her heartbeat so loud in her ears that she was certain everyone in the bar could hear it hammering against her ribs. This was insane. This was suicide. This was exactly the kind of mistake that got people like her killed in alleys behind bars, just like this one. But she was already moving. Dante's glass sat precisely where she'd expected, the condensation creating a perfect ring on the polished wood surface. His attention was focused on the conversation with his men, something about shipping schedules and territorial adjustments that made her skin crawl with recognition. She'd heard Marcus use similar language when he thought she wasn't listening. She slid the napkin beneath his glass with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent months perfecting the art of being overlooked. Her fingers barely grazed the cold surface before she forced herself to step back, to breathe, to pretend this was just another night serving drinks to people whose names she didn't want to know. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd succeeded. Then Dante's conversation stopped mid-sentence. She watched his gaze drop to the glass, saw the exact moment he noticed the corner of white paper protruding from beneath it. His hand moved with casual grace, unfolding the napkin as if checking a receipt or a phone number from an admirer. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. When he looked up, his eyes found hers with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. They were dark, almost black in the bar's dim lighting, and absolutely merciless. The kind of eyes that had seen too much, done too much, and forgotten how to blink first in any confrontation. She should have looked away, should have busied herself with wiping glasses or checking inventory or any of the dozen tasks that would have given her an excuse to avoid his gaze. Instead, she found herself trapped in the weight of his attention, unable to move as he slowly, deliberately, reached for his untouched whiskey. Her heart stopped entirely when his fingers wrapped around the glass. "Don't," she thought desperately, knowing her expression was probably screaming her guilt to anyone who cared to look. "Please don't." Instead of drinking, he set the glass down with careful precision and rose from his seat. Every movement was controlled, measured, the behavior of a man who understood that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. His men tensed instantly, hands moving inside their jackets in response to some signal she couldn't detect. But Dante's attention remained fixed on her as he approached the bar. Each step seemed to last forever, giving her ample time to catalog the breadth of his shoulders, the way his expensive suit couldn't quite hide the muscled frame beneath, the silver watch that caught the light as he moved. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. Beautiful and absolutely terrifying. When he reached the bar, he leaned forward just enough that his words would carry to her ears alone. His voice was exactly what she'd expected. Deep, controlled, with the faintest hint of an accent that suggested old-world heritage and newer-world power. "You just saved my life," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now you're coming with me." Before she could react, before she could protest, or run, or explain that she was nobody worth protecting, his hand closed around her wrist. Not painfully, not roughly, but with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never had his decisions questioned. And just like that, Sienna Blackwood's carefully constructed invisible life shattered into pieces as irreparable as the whiskey glass that crashed to the floor behind them. The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos that reminded Sienna exactly why she'd spent 8 months trying to avoid situations like this. Dante's men moved with military precision the moment he released her wrist and gave a subtle nod toward the man in the gray suit. There was no commotion, no dramatic confrontation that would have drawn the attention of Meridian's other patrons. One moment, the would-be assassin was sitting calmly at the bar, and the next he was being escorted toward a back exit by 2 men whose smiles never wavered. The efficiency was terrifying. "Stay close," Dante said, his hand settling at the small of her back with a familiarity that made her skin burn through the thin fabric of her work blouse. "We're leaving." "But I can't just leave," she protested, her voice barely above a whisper as her mind scrambled to process what was happening. "My shift doesn't end until 2, and Marcus, my manager, he'll fire me if I abandon my station without notice." The moment his name left her lips, she realized her mistake. Dante's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that probably meant nothing to most people but sent ice through her veins. He'd cataloged the information, filed it away with the same methodical precision his men had used to handle the poisoning attempt. "Your manager will understand," Dante replied, and something in his tone suggested that Marcus would indeed understand, whether he wanted to or not. "Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you somewhere safe." Safe. The word should have been comforting, but all Sienna could think about was another man who'd promised her safety, who'd used that promise to build a cage so beautiful she hadn't noticed the bars until it was too late. Her breathing quickened, shallow pants that she tried to disguise as she followed Dante toward the restaurant's entrance. The night air hit her face like a slap, Chicago's autumn chill cutting through the adrenaline that had been keeping her warm. Dante's car waited at the curb, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than she'd made in her entire life. The kind of vehicle that whispered power and money with every clean line and tinted window. As the door closed behind her and the city lights began to blur past the windows, reality started to sink in with the weight of concrete settling in her stomach. "I can't do this," she said suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. "You don't understand. I can't be involved in whatever this is. I have to work. I have bills. I have a life that doesn't include—" She gestured helplessly at the luxury surrounding them, people trying to poison each other over drinks. Dante studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in details she wished she could hide. The way her hands trembled despite her efforts to still them. The careful distance she maintained between their bodies on the leather seat. The unconscious way she positioned herself closer to the door, as if calculating escape routes, even now. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. "What?" "The man who taught you to be afraid," Dante clarified, and his voice held a gentleness that somehow made the question more dangerous. "The one who made you believe that protection always comes with a price." Sienna's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't said anything about Marcus, about her past, about the reasons she'd spent months perfecting the art of invisibility. But apparently, she hadn't needed to. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied. Dante's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd heard similar lies before. "Perhaps," he said, "but here's what you need to understand about your current situation. The man who tried to poison me tonight belongs to the Torino family. They've been trying to eliminate me for the better part of 2 years, and they're not particularly concerned about collateral damage." The car turned onto a tree-lined street, where the buildings grew taller and more expensive with each block. Sienna pressed her face to the window, watching the city transform around them from the gritty familiarity of her neighborhood to something that belonged in magazines she couldn't afford. "You interfered with their operation," Dante continued. "You're now a witness to attempted murder, and more importantly, you're the reason their plan failed. They'll come for you, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to leave loose ends." "But I won't tell anyone," she said desperately. "I don't even know what I saw, not really. I can disappear. I'm good at that. I can just vanish and you'll never have to worry about me again." Dante's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "You think disappearing is easy? You think people like the Torinos don't have resources, connections, patience?" He leaned forward slightly, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her stomach flutter despite her fear. "They found you at Meridian tonight. What makes you think they won't find you wherever you run?" The truth of his words settled over her like a lead blanket. She'd spent 8 months running from Marcus, 8 months looking over her shoulder and jumping at shadows, only to stumble straight into something infinitely worse. "So what are you saying?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I'm saying that as of tonight, you're under my protection," Dante replied, "whether you want to be or not." The car pulled up in front of a building that scraped the Chicago sky, all glass and steel reaching toward stars that seemed impossibly far away. A doorman appeared the moment their vehicle stopped, opening her door with the kind of deference usually reserved for royalty. "This is my home," Dante said as he guided her through a lobby that looked like something out of an architectural magazine. "For the foreseeable future, it's also yours." The elevator ride to the top floor passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of expensive machinery and Sienna's increasingly rapid heartbeat. When the doors opened directly into Dante's penthouse, she felt her last reserves of composure crack completely. The space was massive, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that stretched beyond the horizon. Modern furniture in blacks and grays created clean lines throughout the open floor plan, while artwork that probably belonged in museums decorated the walls. But what struck her most was how lived in it felt despite its obvious luxury. Books scattered across the coffee table. A coffee mug sitting forgotten on the kitchen counter. A throw blanket draped carelessly over the back of the couch, as if someone had been watching television before being called away on urgent business. It was the home of a man who was dangerous, powerful, and utterly alone. "Maria will show you to your room," Dante said, gesturing to a middle-aged woman who'd appeared from somewhere deeper in the apartment. "She's my housekeeper, but more importantly, she's someone you can trust. If you need anything, ask her." Sienna followed Maria down a hallway lined with more expensive art, her feet sinking in a carpet so plush it felt like walking on clouds. The guest room was larger than her entire apartment, complete with its own bathroom and a bed that could have accommodated 4 people comfortably. "There are clothes in the closet," Maria explained in accented English, her kind eyes taking in Sienna's work uniform with maternal concern. "Different sizes, different styles. Dante, he thinks of everything when it comes to protecting his people. His people, as if she'd somehow become part of something larger than herself without conscious choice." After Maria left, Sienna sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to process what had happened. She'd saved a man's life, and in return, he'd made her a prisoner in a golden cage that made Marcus's manipulations look like amateur hour. But as she looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below, something unexpected settled in her chest alongside the fear and uncertainty. For the first time in 8 months, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. For the first time since Marcus, she wasn't calculating how many steps it would take to reach the nearest exit. The door had a lock, but she suspected she wouldn't need it. Whatever Dante Romano was, whatever he represented, he'd made her a promise. And something told her that when men like him made promises, they kept them, even if it killed them. Sienna woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been bacon, scents so foreign to her usual morning routine that for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the unfamiliar room in golden hues that made everything look like a dream sequence. Then memory crashed back with the force of a cold shower. Dante Romano, the poison drink, the Torino family who wanted her dead simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'd slept better than she had in months. The realization disturbed her more than the danger itself. 8 months of hypervigilance, of sleeping with a baseball bat next to her bed and triple-checking locks, and one night in a stranger's penthouse had given her the kind of rest she'd forgotten existed. The clothes Maria had mentioned hung in the closet exactly as promised, ranging from designer jeans to elegant dresses in multiple sizes. Sienna selected the simplest option she could find, dark jeans and a soft blue sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and made her way toward the kitchen following the increasingly appetizing aromas. She found Dante standing at the stove, his back to her as he tended what looked like a professional-grade breakfast. He'd traded last night's expensive suit for dark jeans and a white button-down shirt rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His hair was slightly disheveled in a way that made him look younger, more approachable, though no less dangerous. "Good morning," he said without turning around, as if he'd sensed her presence the moment she entered the room. "I wasn't sure what you preferred, so I made a little of everything." The kitchen island was indeed covered with enough food to feed a small army. Eggs Benedict, perfectly crisp bacon, fresh fruit arranged with artistic precision, and what appeared to be homemade pastries that belonged in a French bakery. "You cooked all this yourself?" she asked, settling onto one of the leather bar stools with cautious appreciation. "Cooking relaxes me," Dante replied, finally turning to face her with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "Most people find that hard to believe, given my reputation, but there's something peaceful about creating instead of destroying." The admission hung between them, more personal than she'd expected from a man who'd essentially kidnapped her 12 hours earlier. She watched him plate her breakfast with the same careful precision he'd used to handle last night's crisis, and found herself wondering what other contradictions lay beneath his polished exterior. "So what happens now?" she asked, accepting the plate he offered. "Do I just stay here indefinitely, while you handle whatever needs handling. Dante poured himself coffee from what looked like a professional espresso machine, his movements economical and practiced. The Torinos won't stop because one attempt failed, he said. They've been trying to eliminate me for 2 years, ever since I refused to let them expand their drug operations through my territory. Your territory, Sienna repeated, testing the words. So the rumors are true. You really are? Mafia, he finished for her, settling onto the stool across from hers. Yes, 4th generation, though I've worked hard to modernize our operations. We focus primarily on legitimate businesses now. Construction, restaurants, real estate development. But some traditions die hard, and protecting our people from predators like the Torinos is one of them. She should have been terrified, should have been calculating escape routes and wondering if she could reach the door before he stopped her. Instead, she found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation that never came. I don't understand, she said finally. If you're so legitimate, why do they want you dead? Because legitimacy threatens their business model, Dante explained, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations. They make money from desperation. Loan sharking, drug distribution, human trafficking. All of it depends on keeping communities broken and afraid. When neighborhoods prosper, when people have legitimate opportunities, the Torinos lose their customer base. He gestured toward the windows, where Chicago sprawled in all directions beneath the morning sun. I've spent the last 5 years buying up properties in areas they use to control, turning them into legitimate businesses that employ local residents at fair wages. It's not altruism, it's strategy. Healthy communities don't breed the kind of desperation organized crime feeds on. Sienna took a bite of the eggs Benedict, which tasted even better than they looked, and tried to reconcile this explanation with everything she thought she knew about men like Dante. You make it sound noble. Nothing about this life is noble, Dante said quietly. I've done things, will continue to do things, that would horrify you. But I choose my battles carefully now. I protect what's mine, I eliminate threats to my family and my people, and I try to leave the world slightly better than I found it. The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she focused on her breakfast and the city view beyond the windows, trying to process how her carefully ordered life had become this complicated in the space of 12 hours. That's when she noticed the small cut on her index finger from last night's broken glass, a thin red line that had reopened slightly when she'd gripped her coffee cup too tightly. You're bleeding, Dante observed, rising from his seat with sudden alertness that reminded her exactly how dangerous he could be. It's nothing, she said quickly, but he was already moving around the island toward her, his attention focused with the intensity of a man accustomed to cataloging every potential threat. Let me see, he said, and before she could protest, his hands were cradling hers with surprising gentleness. His skin was warm, calloused in places that suggested he'd done more manual labor than his expensive suits implied. The way he held her hand, examining the small cut with the careful attention of someone checking for serious injury, sent heat racing up her arm and settling somewhere low in her stomach. This needs to be cleaned properly, he said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt like something else entirely. The glasses at Meridian aren't always as clean as they should be. He led her to the kitchen sink, keeping her hand in his as he ran warm water over the cut and applied antibiotic ointment from a first aid kit that appeared from somewhere in the perfectly organized drawers. His touch was clinical, professional, but she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened every time his fingers brushed against her skin. There, he said finally, applying a small bandage with the same meticulous care. That should heal without any complications. Thank you, she managed, though her voice came out slightly breathless. You're very good at that. I've had practice, Dante replied, and something in his tone suggested experiences she probably didn't want to know about. That's when his phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the domestic intimacy of the moment like a blade. Dante's expression shifted instantly, all traces of gentleness replaced by cold alertness as he glanced at the caller ID. "Stay here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his orders questioned. "Don't leave the apartment for any reason." He answered the call as he walked toward what she assumed was his office, but she could still hear fragments of the conversation. Words like warehouse, explosion, and casualties that made her stomach clench with renewed fear. When he returned 20 minutes later, his face was carved from granite. "They hit 3 of our businesses last night," he said without preamble. "A restaurant in Little Italy, a construction site in Chinatown, and a community center we fund in Pilsen. No one was killed, but the message was clear." Sienna felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "This is because of me, isn't it? Because I interfered last night?" Dante's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "This is because the Torinos are animals who mistake restraint for weakness. What happened last night was just the excuse they were looking for to escalate a conflict that's been building for months. But people are getting hurt because I couldn't mind my own business," she insisted, rising from her stool with agitation that demanded movement. "You should have let me disappear. You should have let them think their plan worked and gone on with your life." "My life?" Dante stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them with heat and intensity. "You saved my life last night. Do you have any idea what that means to me? What it means to my family, my people?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "I used to be married," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, "to a man who promised to protect me, to take care of me, to make sure I never had to worry about anything ever again." Dante went very still, his dark eyes fixed on her face with the intensity of someone hearing critical intelligence. "Marcus was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted when I was 22, and stupid enough to believe that love looked like possession." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the morning warmth. "He started small, suggesting I didn't need to work because he could support us both, convincing me to cut ties with friends who didn't understand our relationship, making me dependent on him for everything from money to transportation to human contact." Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. "By the time I realized what was happening, I was completely isolated. No job, no friends, no family willing to help because I'd pushed them all away on his advice. And when I finally tried to leave, he made it clear that he considered me his property, not his wife." Dante's hands had curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained carefully controlled when he spoke. "How long?" 3 years, she whispered. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of measuring every word and action against his potential reaction. 3 years of being told I was lucky to have someone who cared enough to protect me from my own poor judgment. "What changed?" Dante asked. Sienna smiled bitterly. "His sister." Marcus had a younger sister, barely 18, who reminded him too much of me when we first met. I watched him start using the same tactics on her that he'd used on me, and I realized that if I didn't do something, she'd end up just as trapped as I was. "So you left." "I ran," she corrected. "In the middle of the night, with nothing but a bag of clothes and what little money I'd managed to hide over the months. I've been running ever since, working jobs that pay cash, living in places that don't require credit checks or references, always looking over my shoulder." She met Dante's eyes, surprised by the fury she saw burning there. "That's why I can't do this again. I can't be someone's responsibility, someone's project to protect and manage. I won't survive it a second time." Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "I am nothing like him," he said quietly, but with such conviction that she felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "How can you be sure?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but unable to hide it. "Because I would die before I became the kind of man who breaks something beautiful just to prove he owns it," Dante replied, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with devastating gentleness. "And because you're not my possession, Sienna, you're under my protection by choice, and you can leave the moment you decide that choice no longer serves you." The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like she was something precious he'd never expected to find. She found herself leaning into his touch, drawn by the promise of safety and something infinitely more dangerous. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she watched his gaze drop to her lips with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. They were moving closer, the space between them shrinking with each shared breath, when his phone erupted in sharp, urgent rings that shattered the moment like glass hitting concrete. Dante stepped back immediately, his expression shifting back into the cold mask of control as he answered the call. This time, she heard him clearly. "How many?" he asked, and his voice had gone deadly quiet in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Casualties?" A pause. "Property damage?" Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute finality. "No more warnings. No more restraint. They want a war, they'll get one. But it ends tonight." He ended the call and turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sienna saw past the civilized veneer to the man underneath. The man who'd built an empire on strategic violence and protected it with calculated brutality. It should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself thinking about his hands on her face, about the careful way he'd bandaged her cut, about the promise in his voice when he'd sworn he would never break something beautiful. "This ends tonight," he repeated, and she realized he was talking to her now, not his subordinates. "The Torinos cross a line they can't uncross. I'm going to eliminate this threat permanently, and when I come back, you'll never have to look over your shoulder again." The words should have sounded like a threat. Instead, they sounded like a promise. And for the first time in 8 months, Sienna Blackwood found herself believing that someone might actually be strong enough to keep her safe. The War Room, as Maria called it, occupied the entire second floor of Dante's penthouse. Maps of Chicago covered one wall, marked with colored pins that Sienna suspected represented territories, businesses, and strategic positions she'd rather not think about too closely. A conference table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by chairs that had hosted conversations she definitely didn't want to know about. But what struck her most was how Dante moved through the space, his earlier fury refined into something cold and calculating. This was his element, she realized. The domestic man who'd made her breakfast and bandaged her cut was real, but this was who he became when someone threatened his family. The transformation should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the strategic mind at work. Marco, his second-in-command, spread surveillance photos across the table, while other men she didn't recognize provided updates and voices that carried the weight of military training. The Torinos had hit 6 more locations overnight, each attack precisely timed to stretch Dante's resources thin. "They're trying to force us to spread our defenses," one of the men said, pointing to locations marked in red on the map. "Classic strategy. Make us react instead of act." Dante studied the pattern, his dark eyes tracking connections that weren't immediately obvious to Sienna. But she'd spent 3 years watching Marcus manipulate situations to his advantage, and something about the attack pattern felt familiar in the worst possible way. "It's not just about stretching your defenses," she said suddenly, then immediately wished she could take the words back when every man in the room turned to look at her. Dante's expression was unreadable. "Explain." She shouldn't be involved in this. Shouldn't be offering tactical advice to a mafia boss about how to handle his enemies. But the pattern was so clear now that she couldn't stay silent. "Look at the timing," she said, moving closer to the table despite her instincts screaming at her to stay invisible. "They hit your businesses in waves, but not random waves. Each location they targeted has something in common besides being yours. Marco Froneth. They're all in different neighborhoods, different types of operations. But they all have something Marcus would know about," Sienna continued, her voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. "The restaurant where I used to eat lunch when I worked downtown. The construction site 3 blocks from my old apartment. The community center where I volunteered before I met him." The silence that followed was deafening. "You think your ex-husband is feeding them intelligence," Dante said, his voice deadly quiet. "Ex-husband who's been looking for me For 8 months, Sienna confirmed, ice settling in her stomach. Ex-husband who knows my habits, my preferences, my history better than anyone. If they found him, if they offered him something he wanted, they offered him you. Dante finished, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the penthouse. Red lights flashed on monitors around the room as Marco's phone exploded with incoming calls. "They're here," Marco said tersely, coordinating with security teams through his earpiece. 3 vehicles, armed assault team. They've disabled the building's main security system. "How many?" Dante demanded, already moving toward a cabinet that probably contained enough weapons to arm a small military unit. "Too many," Marco replied, "and they know exactly where they're going." Dante turned to Sienna, his face carved from granite. "There's a safe room," he said. "Bulletproof, independent security system, enough supplies to last a week. You'll be protected until this is over." "No," Sienna said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If Marcus is involved, if he's helping them, then they know things about me that your security systems can't account for. I won't hide while you fight a war that exists because of me. You'll hide because I'm telling you to hide," Dante replied, his authority absolute and uncompromising. "And you'll fail because you don't understand how Marcus thinks," Sienna shot back. "You're planning to fight soldiers, but he's not a soldier. He's a manipulator. He doesn't attack strength. He finds weakness and exploits it." The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere below them, sharp cracks that echoed through the building's steel and glass structure. Dante's men moved with practiced efficiency, taking positions and coordinating defensive strategies through earpieces that crackled with urgent communications. "Tell me," Dante said suddenly, his eyes fixed on hers with laser intensity. "He'll try to separate us," Sienna said quickly, adrenaline making her thoughts crystal clear. "Not through force, but through psychology. He'll make you choose between protecting me and protecting your people. He'll create a scenario where saving one means sacrificing the other." Even as she spoke, Marco's voice cut through the chaos. "Boss, they've taken Maria hostage. They're demanding a trade. Her for the girl." Sienna felt her heart stop completely. Maria, who'd shown her kindness and welcomed her into this dangerous world. Maria, who was about to die because Sienna had been too selfish to disappear when she had the chance. "No," Dante said flatly. "We don't negotiate with terrorists. But if Marcus is involved, if he's the one pulling the strings, then this isn't about terrorism," Sienna said desperately. "It's about control. He won't hurt Maria if he thinks he can get what he really wants." "What does he really want?" Dante asked. "Me, broken, independent, and grateful to be rescued," Sienna replied. "He doesn't just want me back. He wants me to need him, which means he needs you to fail to protect me." The gunfire was getting closer now, the sound of boots in stairwells and shouted orders that meant their time was running out. Dante made a decision with the speed that had probably kept him alive for 34 years. "Marco, take half the team and move to intercept on the 15th floor. Make noise, draw their attention, but don't engage directly unless they force your hand." "What about Maria?" Marco asked. "We get her back, but not by playing their game," Dante replied. He turned to Sienna, his expression intense. "You said he exploits weakness. What's his?" Sienna's mind raced through 3 years of psychological warfare, searching for the pattern that had finally allowed her to escape. "His need to be the smartest person in the room," she said finally. "He can't resist proving that he's anticipated every possible move. If you can make him think he's winning, make him think he's outsmarted you, he'll get overconfident. And overconfidence makes people careless," Dante finished. The next hour passed in a blur of controlled violence that reminded Sienna exactly how dangerous the man protecting her really was. Dante's plan worked perfectly, drawing the assault team into a trap that neutralized them without risking Maria's life. But it was the aftermath, when the immediate threat had been eliminated and they were alone in his bedroom, checking each other for injuries, that changed everything between them. "You were incredible," Dante said quietly, his hands moving over her arms and shoulders with clinical precision that gradually became something else entirely. The way you analyzed the situation, understood the psychology behind their strategy. I've never seen anything like it. His touch lingered on her wrist, where her pulse was beating so hard, she was certain he could feel it through her skin. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a different kind of intensity that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. When they took Maria, when I realized that people I care about were in danger because of me, I thought I was going to fall apart. But you didn't, Dante said, his thumb tracing circles on her inner wrist that sent heat shooting up her arm. You did the opposite. You got stronger. They were standing too close, breathing the same air, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, but focused entirely on each other. When Dante's hand came up to cup her cheek, Sienna didn't pull away. "This is dangerous," she whispered, though she was already leaning into his touch. "Everything about my life is dangerous," Dante replied, his voice rough with want. "But you make me want to be careful for the first time in years." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the gentle, almost kiss from that morning. This was desperate, hungry, born from the knowledge that they'd both nearly lost something precious before they'd even had a chance to claim it. Sienna responded with 8 months of loneliness and fear transformed into need that threatened to consume her completely. His hands tangled in her hair, holding her close as if he was afraid she might disappear, while hers explored the breadth of his shoulders and the solid strength of his chest. He tasted like coffee and danger and promises she'd forgotten how to believe in. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips, his control hanging by the thinnest of threads. Instead of answering with words, Sienna began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly as she revealed the scarred skin beneath. She'd expected the scars, evidence of a life lived in violence. But she hadn't expected the careful way he watched her face, cataloging every reaction to ensure she wasn't frightened. "You're beautiful," she whispered, tracing a thin white line that ran across his ribs. "All of you." What followed was unlike anything she'd experienced with Marcus, where intimacy had been about possession and control. Dante touched her like she was precious, like her pleasure mattered more than his own, like consent was an ongoing conversation rather than a single yes or no. He undressed her slowly, reverently, stopping every few moments to ask if she was comfortable, if she wanted to continue, if anything felt wrong. His hands mapped her body with patient thoroughness, finding sensitive spots that made her arch against him with sounds she'd never made before. When he finally moved over her, his weight supported on his forearms, so he wouldn't crush her, she felt safe and powerful simultaneously. This was her choice, her desire, her decision to trust someone with the most vulnerable parts of herself. "Tell me what you need," he murmured against her throat, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. "You," she breathed, her hands sliding down his back to pull him closer. "Just you." The connection was intense, overwhelming in the best possible way. He moved with careful control until she began to move with him, their rhythm building into something that felt less like sex and more like a conversation conducted in touches and breathless words. Afterward, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like expensive detergent and the cologne he wore, her head on his chest while his fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I've never done that before," Sienna said quietly. Dante went very still beneath her. "Never? I mean, I've had sex, obviously, but I've never made love," she clarified, lifting her head to meet his eyes. "There's a difference." "Yes," Dante said simply. "There is." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to voice. But as Sienna settled back against his chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This wasn't just about forced proximity or attraction born from adrenaline and danger. This was about two broken people finding something in each other that made them feel whole. That's when Dante's phone rang, shattering the peaceful aftermath with its sharp intrusion. He reached for it reluctantly, his free arm tightening around Sienna as if to anchor her to the moment they were leaving behind. "Romano," he answered, his voice carefully neutral despite the intimacy of their position. Sienna couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Dante's expression shift from contentment to concern to something approaching fury. "When?" he asked sharply. "How long ago?" A pause, then. "Are you certain it's him?" Another pause, longer this time, and when Dante spoke again, his voice carried the cold edge she'd learned to recognize as extremely dangerous. "Find him," he said. "I don't care what it takes or who you have to go through. Find Marcus Whitmore and bring him to me." He ended the call and looked down at Sienna, his dark eyes serious. "They found the connection," he said quietly. "Marcus has been in contact with the Torinos for 3 weeks. He's been feeding them intelligence about your habits, your fears, your history." Sienna felt ice settle in her stomach. "How much does he know about where I am?" "Everything," Dante replied grimly, "including the fact that you're here with me right now." The words hung between them like a death sentence. All the safety she'd felt in his arms, all the hope she'd allowed herself to feel about a future that included both protection and love, crumbled into dust. "He's not just coming for me," she whispered, understanding the full scope of Marcus's revenge with crystal clarity. "He's coming for both of us." The call came at 3 in the morning, dragging them both from the kind of sleep that only came after emotional and physical exhaustion. Dante was instantly alert, his body tense as he reached for the phone, but Sienna felt the change in his breathing and knew before he answered that this was the call they'd been dreading. "They have Isabella." Marco's voice was tight with controlled rage. "Marcus Whitmore and 3 Torino soldiers took her from her apartment 20 minutes ago." Sienna felt the blood drain from her face as Dante's sister's name registered. Isabella, who was barely 22, who studied art history at Northwestern and had nothing to do with her brother's dangerous world except the misfortune of sharing his blood. "What do they want?" Dante asked, though they both already knew the answer. "A trade," Marco confirmed. "Her for Sienna. They're giving us 2 hours to decide." Dante was already moving, pulling on clothes with the efficient speed of someone who dressed for battle more times than she wanted to count. His face had transformed into the cold mask she'd seen during yesterday's crisis, all traces of the gentle lover replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. "No negotiations," he said flatly. "We get Isabella back, but not by giving them what they want." But Sienna was already shaking her head, her mind racing through the implications with crystal clarity. "This is exactly what Marcus wants," she said. "He's not just trying to get me back. He's trying to force you to choose between saving your family and protecting me." "That's not a choice," Dante replied without hesitation. "I protect everyone I love." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't process. But there wasn't time for feelings, not when Isabella was in the hands of men who would hurt her just to prove a point. "Marcus knows you'll never trade me for her," Sienna continued, pulling on the clothes she discarded hours earlier. "Which means he's counting on you trying a rescue mission. He'll be prepared for that." "Then we give him what he expects," Dante said grimly, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "We rescue her." "No," Sienna said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We give him what he thinks he wants, and we use his overconfidence against him." The plan that formed was insane, dangerous, and completely dependent on Sienna's understanding of Marcus's psychological weaknesses. But as she explained it to Dante and his assembled team, she saw the moment when his strategic mind recognized the brutal elegance of using Marcus's own tactics against him. "You're not going in alone," Dante said when she finished outlining her role. "I have to," Sienna replied. "Marcus needs to believe he's won, that he's outsmarted you completely. If he sees your people, if he suspects it's a trap, he'll hurt Isabella just to hurt you." The warehouse where they'd chosen to make the exchange sat on the edge of the industrial district, isolated enough that gunfire wouldn't immediately draw police attention. Sienna approached the building with her hands visible, wearing a wire so thin it was virtually undetectable, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. Marcus was waiting exactly where she'd expected him to be, positioned near the center of the space with Isabella bound to a chair beside him. Even from a distance, Sienna could see that Dante's sister was unharmed but terrified, her dark eyes wide with fear that made Sienna's chest burn with protective fury. "Hello, darling," Marcus said as she entered the pool of light cast by overhead fixtures that had seen better decades. "You look well. Different. Stronger, perhaps." He looked exactly the same as the day she'd fled their marriage, expensively dressed and perfectly groomed, his smile carrying the same cold calculation that had once made her feel special and now made her skin crawl. "Let her go, Marcus," Sienna said quietly. "Your fight is with me, not with an innocent girl." "Innocent?" Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off concrete walls. "She's Romano blood, which means she's anything but innocent. Do you have any idea what her brother has done to earn his reputation?" "I know exactly what he's done," Sienna replied. "I also know why he's done it." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features. She'd changed since leaving him, and he was just beginning to understand how much. "You're defending him," Marcus observed. "The man who kidnapped you, who forced you into his world of violence and crime." Stockholm Syndrome is a fascinating psychological phenomenon, isn't it? "He didn't kidnap me," Sienna said calmly. "He saved my life, and then he gave me the choice to leave whenever I wanted to." "Choice," Marcus repeated mockingly, "as if you've ever made a good choice in your life without my guidance." That's when Sienna saw it, the moment of overconfidence she'd been waiting for. Marcus had positioned himself exactly where she'd predicted he would, close enough to Isabella to use her as a human shield, but far enough from his Torino allies to ensure he controlled the conversation. "You're right," she said, taking a step closer. "I've always been terrible at making decisions. That's why I need you to help me understand something." Marcus preened slightly, unable to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority. "What's that, darling?" "Why you thought betraying me to the Torinos would bring me back to you," Sienna said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you cared more about revenge than getting your wife back." The words hit their mark exactly as she'd intended. Marcus's face darkened with a rage that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior, the fury that erupted whenever anyone questioned his logic or his motives. "Revenge?" he snarled. "This isn't about revenge, it's about consequences. You left me, humiliated me, destroyed everything I'd built for us. Did you think there wouldn't be a price for that kind of betrayal?" That's when the lights went out. The warehouse plunged into complete darkness for exactly 10 seconds, long enough for Dante's team to move into position using night vision equipment, while Marcus and his allies scrambled to adjust to the sudden blindness. When emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in hellish red, the tactical situation had changed completely. Dante emerged from the shadows behind Marcus like an avenging angel, his weapon trained with deadly precision while his men had the Torino soldiers surrounded. But Marcus still had a gun pressed to Isabella's head. "Let her go," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. "Your fight is with me." "Actually," Marcus replied, his composure returning as he calculated the new dynamic, "my fight is with both of you. You see, I've spent 3 weeks learning everything there is to know about Dante Romano's weaknesses, and apparently, my dear wife has become one of them." He's not wrong, Sienna thought with crystal clarity. Marcus had found the one threat that would neutralize Dante completely, harm to someone he loved. That's when she made a decision that would have terrified her 8 months ago. "Marcus always told me I was too impulsive," she said conversationally, stepping closer despite the weapon pointed at Isabella's head. "Too emotional, too likely to act without thinking through the consequences." "What are you doing?" Dante asked sharply, but Sienna kept her attention focused on Marcus. "He was right about that," she continued. "I never did learn to think strategically, which is why Marcus never saw her grab the knife from his belt until the blade was already pressed against his throat. "Drop the gun," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Drop it now, or I'll show you exactly how impulsive I can be." For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. The woman who'd been too afraid to argue with him about dinner plans had just put a knife to his throat with the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to lose. "You won't," he said, but his voice carried the first note of uncertainty she'd ever heard from him. "Try me," Sienna replied. The gunshot that followed was deafening in the enclosed space. But it wasn't Marcus who fired. Dante had put 2 bullets in the chest of the Torino soldier who tried to take advantage of the distraction, his aim perfect despite the poor lighting and the life-threatening tension of the standoff. Marcus's gun clattered to the concrete floor as Sienna's knife pressed deeper against his throat, drawing a thin line of blood that made him go very still. "It's over, Marcus," she said quietly. "The Torinos are dead, your leverage is gone, and you're surrounded by people who have very good reasons to kill you." But instead of begging or bargaining or trying to manipulate the situation, Marcus did something that chilled her to the bone. He smiled. "You think you've won," he said softly, "but you just proven my point. Look what you become, darling. Look what he's turned you into." The words hit harder than a physical blow because they weren't entirely wrong. The woman holding a knife to her ex-husband's throat wasn't the same person who'd served drinks at Meridian 3 days ago. Violence had touched her, changed her, made her capable of things she'd never imagined. "She's become someone who protects the people she loves," Dante said firmly. "Someone who fights back instead of running away. Someone stronger than you ever let her be." Sienna looked at Dante, at Isabella now free and safe in his arms, at the bodies of the men who'd threatened their families scattered across the warehouse floor. This was his world, brutal and final, and painted in shades of red she'd never wanted to see. But it was also a world where people protected each other, where loyalty meant something, where love was worth fighting for. She lowered the knife. Marcus laughed, the sound bitter and triumphant. "See? He's corrupted you completely, but you still don't have the stomach to finish what you started." That's when Dante moved with lethal speed, his weapon trained on Marcus with the kind of precision that left no room for error. "She doesn't have to," he said quietly. "I do." The single gunshot echoed through the warehouse, final and absolute. In the silence that followed, Sienna felt the last threads connecting her to her old life snap completely. Marcus was dead. The Torinos were eliminated, and she was standing in a warehouse filled with evidence of the violence that surrounded the man she loved. "We should go," Dante said gently, his arm coming around her waist to steady her. "The police will be here soon." As they walked toward the exit, Isabella safe between them, Sienna felt the weight of her choices settling around her shoulders like a heavy coat. She'd chosen this world, chosen him, chosen to become someone who could hold a knife to another person's throat. The question was whether she could live with who she'd become. "I can arrange for new identities," Dante said quietly as they reached his car. "A new life somewhere far from Chicago, far from all of this. You've done enough, been through enough. You don't owe me anything more." Sienna looked at him, at the man who'd given her safety and choice and love without asking for anything in return except the chance to protect her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my family now. This is my choice." And for the first time since Marcus had walked into her life 4 years ago, Sienna Blackwood was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Sienna stood in the conference room that had once been called the War Room, watching Dante present their latest community development proposal to the City Planning Committee with the kind of passion that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with building something lasting. The maps on the walls now showed construction projects instead of territorial disputes. Schools, community centers, affordable housing developments, and legitimate businesses that employed hundreds of Chicago residents at wages that allowed them to build real futures for their families. The Romano name still carried weight in the city, but these days it was associated with philanthropy and urban renewal rather than fear. Mrs. Romano, one of the city council members, said, turning to address her directly, "Your analysis of the economic impact data was particularly impressive. Have you considered pursuing a degree in urban planning?" Sienna smiled, still adjusting to the title that would become official in 3 weeks. "Actually, I've been accepted to Northwestern's graduate program. Part-time, so I can continue working with Dante on these projects. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of continued collaboration, the kind of boring administrative success that would have put her to sleep a year ago, but now felt like victory. Real victory, built on foundation instead of force. After the room cleared, Dante pulled her into his arms with the casual intimacy of a man who'd never had to wonder whether his touch was welcome. Northwestern, he said, pressing his lips to her temple. You didn't tell me you'd applied. I wanted to be sure they'd accept me first, Sienna replied, settling into his embrace with the kind of comfort that still surprised her sometimes. I may have saved your life, but that doesn't qualify me to redesign neighborhoods. You've been redesigning neighborhoods for months, Dante pointed out. You just gave it an academic framework. It was true. What had started as strategic advice during the Torino crisis had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Sienna's understanding of community psychology, combined with her experience of what it felt like to be vulnerable and afraid, had proven invaluable in designing programs that actually served the people they were meant to help. The wedding planning, surprisingly, had been the easy part. Neither of them wanted anything elaborate or public, just family and close friends gathered in the penthouse where they'd first learned to trust each other. Isabella was handling the details with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling in event coordination, though her biggest challenge was keeping the guest list under 20 people. It's going to be perfect, Isabella had assured them both over dinner the previous week. Small, elegant, focused on what actually matters. What actually mattered, Sienna had discovered, was the promise itself rather than the ceremony. The decision to build a life together, to face whatever came next as a team, to choose each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. Especially when it wasn't easy. The pregnancy test had shown 2 pink lines that morning. A secret she'd been carrying for exactly 4 hours while she tried to figure out how to tell the man who'd already given her more happiness than she'd known was possible that their family was about to get larger. There's something I need to tell you, she said against his chest, feeling his arms tighten around her automatically. Before she could find the words, his phone rang with the distinctive tone he used for family calls. Isabella's face appeared on the screen, her expression bright with excitement that could only mean trouble. Guess what I just found out, Isabella said without preamble. Marco's girlfriend is pregnant. Can you believe it? A baby in our family, after all these years of him swearing he'd never settle down. Dante looked genuinely surprised. Marco didn't mention anything about becoming a father. Because he just found out this morning, Isabella continued, clearly thrilled to be the bearer of news. Elena told me everything. They've been trying for months, and she was starting to think maybe it wouldn't happen, but then surprise. She's due in March. That's wonderful news, Sienna managed, though her voice came out slightly strangled. Are you feeling all right? Isabella asked, her concern immediate and obvious. You look pale. Actually, Sienna said, looking up at Dante with a smile she couldn't suppress. I think I might be coming down with something. The same something Elena has, apparently. It took Dante exactly 3 seconds to understand what she was saying. When comprehension dawned across his features, the expression of wonder and joy that transformed his face made her chest tight with emotions she'd never learned names for. Really? He asked quietly, his hands moving to frame her face with the same reverence he'd shown that first morning when he'd bandaged her cut. Really, Sienna confirmed. I was going to tell you tonight, but apparently Isabella had other plans. The sound that Isabella made through the phone could only be described as a squeal of delight. This is the best news ever, she declared. Our babies are going to grow up together. They're going to be best friends. This is perfect. After they ended the call, Dante pulled Sienna close and kissed her with the kind of tenderness that made her forget about everything except the man in her arms and the future they were building together. I love you, he said against her lips, the words still carrying the weight of surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to feel this happy. I love you too, she replied, and meant it in ways she was still learning to understand. That evening, they found themselves back at Meridian, the upscale bar where everything had started 6 months ago. Dante had purchased the building the previous month, though he'd kept the original staff and maintained the elegant atmosphere that had made it successful. The only change was behind the bar, where a small brass plaque commemorated the evening when a bartender's split-second decision had changed two lives forever. "Sometimes I come here just to remember," Sienna admitted as they settled into the same booth where Dante had sat that first night. "To remember what it felt like to be afraid all the time, to have no one to depend on but myself." "You were never as alone as you thought," Dante said, his fingers intertwining with hers across the table. "You had the courage to save a stranger's life when it would have been safer to look away. That strength was always there." Sienna looked around the bar, at the familiar faces of staff who now treated her like family, at the comfortable luxury that no longer intimidated her, at the man whose world she'd chosen to make her own. "What would you have done in Sienna's situation?" she asked, addressing an imaginary audience with the kind of question that had become second nature during her months of helping Isabella with social media promotion for their legitimate businesses. "Would you have slipped that note to warn a stranger, knowing it could put your own life at risk?" Let me know what you think about their journey in the comments. Dante raised an eyebrow. "Are you practicing for tomorrow's video conference with the investors?" "Maybe," Sienna admitted with a laugh. "Isabella says I need to be more comfortable with public speaking if I'm going to represent Romano Enterprises at community meetings." The drive home took them through neighborhoods that had been transformed over the past 6 months. Where once there had been abandoned lots and boarded-up buildings, now there were parks and small businesses and housing developments where families could afford to build stable lives. It wasn't perfect. Rome wasn't built in a day, and Chicago's problems couldn't be solved with good intentions and development money alone. But it was progress, the kind of lasting change that built foundations instead of just treating symptoms. Back at the penthouse, they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city, Sienna's back pressed against Dante's chest while his arms wrapped around her waist. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the warmth of his body protecting her from the autumn chill, the solid strength of a man who'd learned to use his power to build rather than destroy. In a few months, there would be a baby sleeping in the room that had once been a guest bedroom. In a few years, there would be birthday parties and school plays and all the ordinary miracles that made up a life built on love rather than fear. "Are you happy?" Dante asked quietly, his lips brushing against her hair. Sienna thought about the question, about the woman she'd been 6 months ago and the woman she'd become. The bartender who'd been afraid of her own shadow had evolved into someone who could hold her own in city planning meetings, who could stand up to dangerous men when people she loved were threatened, who could build a future with a man whose world had once seemed impossibly foreign. "I'm more than happy," she said finally, settling deeper into his embrace. "I'm home." And as the lights of Chicago twinkled below them like earthbound stars, Sienna Blackwood Romano realized that sometimes the most dangerous decision you could make was also the one that saved your life. The woman who'd slipped a note to a stranger in a bar had found her family, her purpose, and herself. And for the first time since she could remember, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She was looking forward.